It was the summer of 1996. Daniel Lewis Lee, a 23-year-old with ties to white supremacist groups, teamed up with Chevy Kehoe, a man who dreamed of creating a whites-only nation. Their plan: rob William Mueller, a gun dealer in Tilly, Arkansas, to fund their violent revolution. But it wasn't just robbery. It turned into one of the most horrific crimes the state had seen in years. On January 11th, they broke into the Mueller's home. Inside were William, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. The family was bound with duct tape, electrocuted with a stun gun, then covered with plastic bags and gagged. They suffocated slowly, Sarah last. After murdering them, Lee and Kehoe stole guns, ammunition, and cash. But the worst part? They placed the bodies in weighted bags and threw them into the Illinois bayou, like trash. The crime wasn't just brutal, it was symbolic. Fueled by racial hatred, it sent a clear message. These men weren't just killers, they were extremists willing to murder entire families for their cause. Months later, the decomposing bodies were found submerged in the bayou. The scene shocked even seasoned investigators. An innocent child murdered in cold blood. For many, this was more than murder, it was terrorism. In 1999, Daniel Lewis Lee was convicted for the brutal 1996 murder of an Arkansas family. The prosecution argued that Lee, along with his accomplice, Chevy Kehoe, carried out a horrific act of violence. Lee's role was central to the crime. He helped Kehoe execute the plan to rob and kill a family of 3, including an 8-year-old girl. Despite Lee's claim of innocence, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death, and the case was pushed into the federal courts due to the severity of the crime and its nature as a federal offense. Lee's conviction was based on his involvement in the kidnapping, torture, and killing of the victims, and the evidence against him seemed overwhelming. But even as Lee faced the death penalty, questions arose about the fairness of his trial and the strength of the evidence. The trial's most shocking twist came when Chevy Kehoe, the mastermind behind the crime, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Kehoe had been the one to plan the murders, while Lee was allegedly the follower, carrying out his role under Kehoe's influence. Many people found it puzzling that the leader of the crime received a life sentence, while the man who followed orders was sentenced to die. This discrepancy raised questions not only about the fairness of the sentencing, but also about the justice system's handling of the case. Why did the person who pulled the trigger, the one who allegedly carried out the most brutal aspects of the crime, receive a more lenient sentence than the man who had simply followed his instructions? For many, this was a paradox. A young man with limited resources and a questionable background sentenced to die, while the orchestrator of the crime would live out his days in prison. The verdict and the disparity between Lee and Kehoe's sentences shocked the public and sparked debates about the death penalty, criminal justice, and the concept of justice itself. Was the death sentence for Lee fair? Did Kehoe's life sentence reflect the justice that the victims and their families deserved? As the years went on, the case continued to be a focal point in the debates about the death penalty and the complex nature of the justice system. Many believed that Lee's conviction and sentence were not entirely justified, especially with the ongoing questions about whether he was fully responsible for the killings or simply a pawn in Kehoe's violent plans. The victim's family, including the grandmother, publicly opposed the execution. After the tragic events, many believed that justice would be served only through the execution of Robert Bowers, the man responsible for the deadly shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. However, the victim's family had a different perspective, especially Earlene Peterson, the grandmother of one of the victims, who publicly opposed the execution. Earlene Peterson, who had lost her beloved granddaughter, said in an emotional interview, "Killing him won't bring my family back." Her words struck a chord with many, showing that, despite the immense pain and loss, she did not believe in vengeance. She recognized that justice was important, but she made it clear that executing Bowers would not undo the damage or restore what had been lost. Earlene, along with other family members, held strong to the belief that true justice should not come through killing, but rather through accountability and ensuring that the cycle of hatred and violence did not continue. She spoke out at the trial, urging the court to consider a sentence that focused on long-term consequences rather than death. It was a powerful stance, one that highlighted the complexity of grief and the difficult choices families must make when confronted with violence and loss. In the early hours of July 13th, 2020, just hours before Daniel Lewis Lee was scheduled to die, a federal judge issued a temporary stay of execution. The reason? Concerns over the lethal injection protocol and whether it would cause needless suffering. It was a small window of hope for Lee's defense team, who had fought tirelessly for years to halt the execution. That hope didn't last long. In a dramatic overnight reversal, the U.S. Supreme Court intervened around 2 a.m. on July 14th, lifting the stay and clearing the way for the execution to proceed. The opinion stated that justice should not be delayed any longer. At dawn, inside the heavily secured execution chamber at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, Daniel Lewis Lee was led onto the gurney. He wore a simple khaki prison uniform. His ankles and wrists were strapped down. Monitors were attached to his chest. Witnesses, including reporters and relatives of the victims, sat behind glass in silence. Lee looked calm, composed, almost resigned. When asked for his final words, he spoke clearly. "You're killing an innocent man. I didn't do it. I've made my peace with God." At 8:03 a.m., the lethal cocktail began to flow into his veins. For minutes later, his breathing slowed. By 8:07 a.m., he was declared dead. There were no visible signs of pain, no struggle, only stillness. It was the first federal execution in the United States since 2003. Outside the prison, the mood was heavy. Demonstrators held signs that read justice or revenge. Some family members of the victims opposed the execution, believing it would not bring true closure. But for others, it was the end of a long and painful chapter. Daniel Lewis Lee's execution did not bring closure. It opened a new debate. For many, his death marked not justice, but a turning point in America's criminal justice system. The execution faced fierce opposition, not only from activists and human rights groups, but from the victim's own family. Earlene Peterson, the 81-year-old grandmother of one of the victims, had fought for decades to stop Lee's execution. She believed the government got the wrong man. In her words, "Killing Daniel Lee won't bring my family back, and it won't give us peace." The Trump administration, however, defended the move as a return to law and order. It was the first of 13 federal executions carried out in just 6 months, more than any president had overseen in modern history.